Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. And my guest is Elisabeth O'Rourke, Ph.D. She's the clinic director of the MindWell Psychology, LLP. So we're going to talk about anxiety problems in teens and OCD as well. So welcome, Lizzie. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, great. Tell me a bit about your background and how you got to work in these areas, and then we'll talk about what's happening currently with you.
Sure, definitely. So as you said, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I am licensed in the state of New York as well as the state of Vermont, but my home base is New York. And I primarily work with children and adolescents, some young adults in entering early adulthood. And really what got me started working in this area, kind of an old story, but I kind of always liked working with children, was always interested in working with children, and worked in a lot of summer camps growing up and tended to gravitate towards the kids who were more anxious, who were shy, who were struggling to fit in, maybe didn't really want to be there. And I kind of kept that in the back of my head as I went through school and majored in psychology in undergrad and really fell in love with this field when I took an intro to clinical psychology course. Kind of opened my eyes to like the possibility, what my interests and skill set could be translated to. And kind of from there started to dabble in a little bit of clinical work. I spent a couple of years working after I graduated undergrad. I worked in a residential program for children in acute psychiatric crisis. It was short-term stabilization, and it was really hard work. We were working with children who were really suffering with elopement, so running away from their homes, even from this facility, who were aggressive, were engaging in self-harm, so really acute. It was really rewarding, though, at the same time as it was very difficult. Got more interested in doing some research as well, so dabbled in that before starting my grad school journey. And then from there, I've worked in different medical settings. Something I'm passionate about is the overlap between mental health and physical health, physical well-being, and then kind of found my way to where I am now, which is a group practice setting where I still continue to work with children and adolescents.
Yeah, what's your current work now? Is there any research or is it all clinical work? And what conditions do you focus on?
Yeah, so I am primarily clinical with a common, like you said, I'm the clinic director of one of our MindWell sites. We have 3 sites. So I'm the clinic director for the Albany site. And so I split my time doing clinical work. I supervise some of the students that we have who are doing practicum, so training years with us. We have about 8 students right now who are training with us. So I supervise, and then I do some admin leadership work. But in terms of the clients I see, the types of cases that I see, it's a lot of anxiety. I would say it's primarily anxiety, depression. I do work with OCD, tics and Tourette, trauma, really you name it. The thing, being a child psychologist, is you kind of see everything and you have to be ready to see everything. And so it is a little bit more of a generalist kind of approach. I see a lot of different presentations.
So in teens and maybe even younger adolescents, are you seeing a big uptake in anxiety? Maybe from what I could see and just anecdotally, at family meetings and meeting with friends and all that, seems like a lot of teens have anxiety. It's really exploded.
Yes, and I think we're living through trying times. I would say I especially saw this during the height of COVID and certainly the aftermath of COVID, and we're still living it to some extent. But with all of the huge transitions that we've been asking everybody to go through, that we've been kind of going through this shared experience as adults, but also these children are going through this as well. And they're having to go from being in school to all of a sudden it's an emergency. We're home and we're learning from home, but we're in school. And then are we going back to school? And a lot of, I think my theory, and I'm sure that there's plenty of research out there to support this, but what I have personally anecdotally seen is yes, certainly an uptick in anxiety. And I think we're also just getting better at talking about anxiety. We are better able to recognize it. I think parents are recognizing it in themselves and in their children. Our educators are certainly getting better. There's whole curricula out there to support teachers and supporting their students who might be experiencing some kind of anxious distress or mood-related disorder. So I think we're getting better at identifying it. We're getting better access to resources for it. And there's a lot of mental health that's embedded in schools. I think pediatricians as well are getting better at it. So I think that anxiety is a huge concern, and we're hopefully getting better at addressing it.
Why is it so pervasive over the past few years? What about COVID? What about these events that has caused this anxiety, you think? And how do you deal with it? What are the protocols?
Yeah, so anxiety really feeds off, in layman's terms, it feeds off of uncertainty and lack of control. We as human beings feel most comfortable when we have certainty and when we have this perception of, if I make a choice, then I know what the outcome is going to be. And so if you take that away from people, we start to feel distressed. We start to worry. We start to feel very uncomfortable. And so when COVID was all the transitions happening during COVID, those transitions make us feel uneasy because they are things that we can't control. We didn't know what was happening. We didn't know what to expect. We didn't know if there was a vaccine that was going to come out. And that's just me reflecting on COVID in particular. There's also a lot in the world that's going on that we have really easy access to with social media, with things like TikTok, with, we can go into, the pros and cons of all of these platforms, and access to information is so important. But at the same time, we're kind of constantly getting information, an overwhelming amount of information, some of which is really positive, but a lot of what media focuses on is the negative of what's going on. So it's a combination of feeling out of control, like what we do, we can't predict what's going to actually happen to us. And so we feel like we can't handle it. And that's the other piece of anxiety, is lack of control and this perception of I can't handle whatever's going on. And so that's what makes us feel anxious. And so that's what I talk about all the time with my clients. I would say all of my clients, whether they meet full criteria for an anxiety disorder or not, the topic of anxiety comes up. And so we have these conversations about, are there certain things that we can do that would help us regain a sense of control? So we talk about, are there some coping skills that we could talk about? Is there mindfulness is a big topic of conversation right now, being more present focused. Being able to sleep hygiene is another big one. So it's
in terms of the control. So a teenager, let's say living at home, it'll be hard. Like, where do they have control? They really don't. In high school, then they come home. At home, they don't really have so much control, and they're getting to the age where they really want to have it. They want to be on their own, or at least some do. How do you resolve anxiety in a teenager, let's say, versus someone that's like 30s, 40s, 50s? How does it manifest differently, and how do you work with them differently?
This is a constant topic of conversation with any of my teen clients and with their parents. One normal developmental experience that teens have is that they try to gain independence by asserting themselves in sometimes adaptive ways, but often in maladaptive ways. So people describe teens as being cranky, irritable, moody, hormonal, all of those things. And all those things might be true, but we also need to understand what's going on in the teen brain. There are so many synapses being created. There's so many hormones swirling. And we're not just talking about like puberty hormones. We're talking about all of the different hormones in the brain that help to manage impulsivity, inhibition, anger, management, just overall feelings, being able to make decisions. And so the teen brain is just just overwhelmed with all of this stuff that's happening developmentally at that time. And so teens respond to that by having all these big emotions and having a harder time managing these emotions and just making decisions. And so often what I talk with parents and teens about is fighting. There's a lot of argumentation. There's a lot of, I don't want to do that. I hate you. That's not fair. A lot of these conversations happen. And so we do a lot of talking about, okay, so parent expectation, this is a common conversation. Parental expectations is that the laundry is done and folded and in your room, then the expectation is you need to put your laundry away, right? Or if you come home, eat dinner with us, then you clean your place at the table and put things in the dishwasher to help take the garbage out, right? Normal like chore expectation kind of routine stuff. Teens all push against that.
Having 3 teenagers, I have no idea what you're talking about, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure it's so foreign. Nobody can relate to this, I'm sure. But it's all very normal. And that's not to say that it's not incredibly frustrating to have constant argumentation around it. But that is how the teenager starts to assert that independence and create a little bit of separation between parent and child. The other thing that any parents of teenagers or young adults may be able to reflect upon is that early on in development, the child is all about the parent. That's the focus of their relationship. And as they get older, they kind of separate a little bit, but it's still like, Mom, Dad, I love you. I want to be around you. Separation is hard. And I do play with my friends, but I want to go and snuggle with you at night kind of thing. And then as you enter teendom, teens start to create more of that separation and they become much more focused on friendships. And that's a normal part of development, but can certainly create some discord and is also part of teen identity development, which is another part of what is going on with anxiety is that teens are trying to figure out who they are in their friendships, who they are in their family, who they are in the world, who they are at school. Like there's just so many layers to it. And all of that uncertainty also adds to this general anxiety uptick that we typically see at this age.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
What other mental conditions do you see? More OCD or self-harm? What else is rising along with anxiety?
So I also see, we call it comorbidity. It's when an individual experiences more than one mental concern, mental health disorder. So I do see a lot of overlap with anxiety and depression. Those tend to go hand in hand. Depression is all about, it's not all about, but part of what reinforces depression is that we pull away when we're feeling that things are not going well. When our mood is low, we kind of withdraw, and that gets further reinforced by anxiety. And so I do see both of those increasing at the same time. OCD, yes, I definitely saw more OCD cases related to cleanliness, and, we call it contamination OCD. So this concern of getting sick, of illness, of being dirty. So I certainly see that. PTSD as well. So trauma-related disorders. ADHD is a big one, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So I would say kind of across the board, we're seeing more sensitivity to, or more specificity in diagnosis. And so we are seeing increases generally across the board in diagnosing these disorders. This doesn't necessarily mean that the whole entire population percentage-wise that the prevalence is increasing, but that we're getting better at identifying it, as well as perhaps some of these large foundational experiences, like what's happening in the world, what's happening more microscopically in each individual's lives, are contributing to increases in diagnosis.
What do you think is the role of smartphones and social media and all this? Do you see it makes teens more one way or another, or you don't think it has much effect?
I think it definitely has an effect. This is certainly out of my research expertise, but I can certainly speak to what I see in my sessions, which is that there's a really positive component to phones, to teens having access to phones, in that, and this conversation comes up a lot, it is social connection. It can really mean the difference between feeling connected to your friends and not. The nature of relationships has changed. We stay in contact, whether you're talking about teens or adults, we stay in contact with our phones. That's how we text each other, we FaceTime, we call, we email, we whatever. And so that's the same for teens. And I have lots of teens who will play games online with their friends. And that's a different medium, but it can be a way of staying socially connected. I also see that I've had teens in my office who are describing being like bullied online, and that can happen pretty covertly. There are platforms that allow that to happen, and then for messages to be erased and for it to be really hard to find a record of these things. And so, and therefore hard for that individual to get support. So, and that's not the only like pitfall of having a phone, but I think we're all concerned about media exposure, social media exposure. And I think we're trying to figure out, I think my strategy in talking with parents is being very thoughtful of how they talk about and educate their child on appropriate use of a phone, talking about what sites they're allowed to go on, what if they're allowed to have social media, at what age they're allowed to. And really that's family dependent. But I think that's a really important conversation to have. But like I said, I don't have expertise on that. I just know what I'm seeing and that there are very clear pros and very clear cons.
Well, what are some trends that you're seeing in teens? Where do things appear to be going with them, their mental space?
One of the things that I'm very hopeful about is that I'm seeing a lot more openness to therapy. Even not long ago when I was in training, when I was going through my graduate program, we were talking about the stigma of mental health, and that's still there. And certain disorders certainly carry more stigma than others. But what I'm seeing generally, just by my own observation, is that children, teens, and young parents are much more open to seeking help, to recognizing when they or their children need help, and just being open to change, really. Being able to say, this is something that's going on that we could benefit from additional support from. So I see that happening. I see a lot of conversations not between my clients, but between my clients and their friends about, oh yeah, I went to see my therapist. What did your therapist have to say about that? Or, and so they'll talk openly about that, which I think is really healthy, that we're taking some of that stigma away. And I truly believe that children and teens, this cohort is going to really redefine how we think about mental health, even down to how we diagnose and think about disorders like autism or ADHD and things that fall under that neurodivergence. How we talk about these things, how we identify these things, all of that. So I see that really changing. And at the same time, I see a lot of clients who are still suffering with a lot of anxiety and depression, and with that, some risky behaviors. But I'm still very hopeful.
Okay, well, very good. Are there any teen issues that you see that are really problematic? Like if a teen's doing self-harm, cutting, is that like a really bad sign? What things are within the realm of healthy and which things are definitely going outside of it and need to be addressed?
It's a great question. And also, unfortunately, a conversation that happens far too often. Self-harm is more than what we generally think of when we're thinking about what is portrayed in the media, what we see in TV shows or movies is cutting generally. That's not all it is. Self-harm can be not taking care of yourself physically, not sleeping when you need to, not showering. It can be abusing substances or more serious substances. It can be cutting yourself off from your friends. So self-harm is a larger umbrella term. And everything is really on a spectrum here in terms of how concerned I would be. With any of those behaviors, though, I'm still concerned. And we're having a conversation about safety and increasing engagement with, we call it activities of daily living. And so taking care of feeding yourself well and sleeping and showering and doing all those kinds of things. But I always worry whenever there's a self-harm component, because whether it's what we call superficial self-harm, which is not really breaking the skin if they're engaging in some cutting behaviors, to more serious where you might even need stitches, I'm always worried about that. But the conversation is a little bit different in terms of what we call safety planning. What is more normal and what can be perceived as self-harm is substance use. in that in this age group, especially older adolescents, there is a lot of experimentation, which is age appropriate and age typical. But it all comes down to how often, what kind of substances are you doing? Like if you're of that age where you can drive, then are you trying to drive while under the influence? Who are you doing this with? Where are you? Who are you talking to? Are you able to talk about this with your parents? And so safety is still a big concern, but that's the world where it's a little bit more developmentally typical and is also part of identity development, that whole process as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to know, like I said, what tells you that something's serious? The teen is not responding in a healthy way with or without therapy, and then what can be done if so? That's what I'm going to ask you about those cases. And how often does it happen? Are most teens okay? They'll have a few rough spots and then they're all right? Or, is a significant percentage of them, so out of whack that they need significant help? Maybe they need to be, I don't know, to go to a mental hospital or things like that. Like, is it very serious for a lot of teens, or for the most part, it's not?
And I don't know the data on this, but it really depends on the setting in which you're working. So for me, I work in outpatient care, and so my clients come and they see me once a week, and then really I'm only seeing them once a week. We don't see them more than that, and we're not available outside of our normal office hours. And so the population that I treat are generally in a place where, yes, I see suicidality, I see self-harm, I see substance use, and I do at times have really significant concerns. But for the most part, the population that I work with, there is a lot of hope there. And not to say that there isn't help for individuals who are experiencing a more acute crisis, but they generally end up in more of like a hospital setting or in an intensive outpatient program. That's a higher level of care, of service. Generally, though, that's a much smaller percentage of the population. And I'll say, too, in the capacity I can speak to the children that I see, the teens that I see, many times they're in care for a few months and then we take a break or they discharge. Sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. But that's kind of the model, is that we're really focusing on skill building of development and doing focused treatments, and then them learning those skills and generalizing them to the world. And so that's kind of the trajectory, is that sometimes children and teens do return to therapy, but a lot of it depends on the diagnosis. A lot of it depends on their experiences, if they've experienced it, like chronic trauma or lots of familial transitions. There's a lot of stuff that can happen that kind of puts an individual on one trajectory versus another, but it's not like an equation like that.
Okay. So where, for parents listening or for teens listening, what would be some resources for them if, the teen listening is having a hard time, or the parent listening is having a hard time with their teens? What kind of counselors should they look for and get? Just psychologists that do CBT, or are there specialist type skills that, they may want to look at?
Yeah, I think it depends on what they're looking for. So it can be a psychologist who's a Ph.D. level of training. It can be mental health counselors, social workers, arts therapists. It depends. It's hard. It's hard for me to say an umbrella, this is who you should see. But generally, I think what we know from the research is that clinicians who are practicing things like cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and dialectical behavioral therapy, those are approaches that are empirically sound and very well validated that can help with really a very broad range of clinical concerns. So if you look for clinicians who practice any of those sort of interchangeably, really, then you're looking at what are the words I'm looking to say here? Then that's usually a good fit. But I also know a lot of clinicians who use art therapy and music therapy, chakra focused therapy to help with supplementing. And so a lot of what I encourage families to do is to think about goodness of fit with the clinician, because that above and beyond anything is what matters the most with progress in therapy. And so sometimes I encourage clients to quote unquote shop around a little bit, although I think it can be hard enough to find a therapist, so that's not always an option. But get to know your therapist, feel connected to your therapist. If that's not happening, if you're not feeling like therapy is a safe place, if you're not feeling like your therapist understands you, that's when you would think about transitioning, not necessarily just because they don't do the specific therapy you're looking for, but goodness of fit is absolutely crucial to the therapeutic process. So I think looking for some of those things in terms of DBT, ACT, and CBT, but also looking for a therapist that you think fits your values, and to use a term that the teens are using, is that you vibe with.
Okay. And for people in New York and Vermont, if they want to get help from your clinic, what's some good contact info for them?
So they can go at the best way to get in touch with us is to go to our website, which is themindwellcenter.com. And you can just find us on Google as well. MindWell Psychology LLP. And we have 3 clinics. So 1 in Vermont, 2 in New York. And they can sign up for phone screens on there. They can email our support email to ask any questions that they might have. And we are able to have a client call in, do a phone screen, and get scheduled within 2 weeks. So we pride ourselves on having a quick access to care. That's really a big problem in this field, is that I can't tell you the number of times I've met with a client for the first time and they said, we've been on wait lists for 5 months.
Oh, wow.
That's the idea. Yeah.
Okay. Well, very good, Lizzie. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate all your help.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.